What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Listography. We are discussing our albums of the year for 1966. 1966 was, another big year following 1965, which saw, the Beatles really kind of kick off the era of the album with Rubber Soul. 1966 kind of saw the same big hitters, the Beatles, the Stones, the Beach Boys, the Kinks, the Who all came out with new releases. And then on the scene, you now had other bands kind of following their lead. Cream released their first album. You had two albums from Simon and Garfunkel, their second and third, and their first that really became popular. The big thing, I think, with 1966 is kind of the escalation between the Beach Boys and the Beatles after Rubber Soul. Brian Wilson went back in the studio, came out with maybe, the magnum opus, what many people consider the best album of all time, Pet Sounds. The Beatles, of course, had Revolver, which other people think is the best album of all time. And of course, Bob Dylan released Blonde on Blonde, which people also believe is the best album of all time. So you kind of had three of the greatest artists of all time kind of at the peak of their powers. So it was a good year for music. I think it's maybe top heavy a little bit because you didn't have, some of the smaller bands were kind of still adjusting to the concept of the album, really. You had the Kinks, sort of the concept album of their own with Face to Face. The Rolling Stones had Aftermath. But again, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, the Stones, the Kinks, it's kind of a repeat of the big guns from 1965.
Touching on what you were talking about with the kind of Beatles-Beach Boy rivalry, I think 66 is pivotal for artists and musicians being aware that a lot more can be done in the studio than they're aware of. I think it's a big year for studio work and not just playing the instruments and singing, having it recorded, but discovering there's a real artistry once you get in there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A couple quick orders of housekeeping. We had a little bit of a debate this past week between the three of us. There was maybe a little miscommunication in terms of what counted for these lists and what did not, and ultimately we came to the determination that we were not going to include live albums in the best of the year videos. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we move forward. The other thing to keep in mind that we just want to give a little extra clarification on is that the runners-up in these videos are not in any particular order. It's one winner, and then the other four are just, they're all equal runners-up.
Thank God. That would be far too hard. My hair would turn gray. I got a lot of hair, so. Yeah,
at this point, 1965 wasn't that difficult for me personally anyway. 66 was harder. And it's just going to get, 67, I was going through the list, and it's impossible. It's crazy how much, the music world expanded kind of following Rubber Soul. And it was the beginning of a new era in music history, for sure.
So for me, as you alluded to in your intro, there was sort of the three big guns, which were kind of obvious choices. Beyond that, I wasn't really sure what to go with. I found a fourth one pretty easily. The fifth spot, I had about maybe 10 records or so in contention, and none of them really seemed to jump out and really want to grab that last spot. It was kind of hard to figure out which one to put in there. Ultimately, I ended up going with a record by a duo who put out two albums this year, going with Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme by Simon and Garfunkel. Another runner-up for me is Swinging Doors by Merle Haggard. I really wanted to get Buck Owens in there in 65, and I just couldn't squeeze him in with all the other albums. Here in 66, there's some room for a good country album. Merle Haggard, part of the Bakersfield sound. If you're not really familiar with that, Bakersfield was kind of a reactionary country movement, countering the Nashville sound, which was becoming very sort of flowery and a lot of orchestral arrangements. Bakersfield sound, really pioneered by Haggard and Buck Owens, sort of the first country genre to be really influenced by rock and roll. They decide to go more electric instrumentation. There's a definitive backbeat, and there's usually really prominent pedal steel. And then you got the big three for me. It's really just a matter of what order to put them in. Runners up, I'm going Blonde on Blonde and Revolver. Revolver is probably my second favorite Beatles album, probably in my top 5 favorite albums of all time. It's kind of like the 2015 Pittsburgh Pirates. You know, they had the second best record in the majors, but still couldn't win their division. And so, for me, the best record of 66 is also the best record of all time, and that is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys.
This is the first win and second nomination of the Beach Boys by Jason.
Just super sophisticated writing, his chord choices, the harmonies, and then taking those compositions into the studio and just really coloring them with so many different instrumentations and arrangements. It's just a beautiful, unparalleled record.
I've got a much better baseball analogy since you're throwing it out for Revolver. The 1993 San Francisco Giants won 103 games and didn't qualify for the playoffs. So there you go. But I'm going to do a bit of a different approach, mainly for you two guys. For those of you in the audience that don't know, we are really excited and giddy about these videos. We're trying not to discuss our picks with one another before we do these videos, but I messed up big time last week and spilled the beans and told them what it was going to be. However, I did have a change of heart. So I'm going to give you my winner first, and then I'm going to give you my finalists. My number one album, my favorite album of 1966 is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys.
This is the first win and first nomination of the Beach Boys by Kramzer.
How can it not be? I really wanted it to be Aftermath by Rolling Stones. I think that is a criminally underrated Rolling Stones album. It's got Lady Jane, which is a top 10 song for me of all time, most likely. Under My Thumb is up there. It's a good record all around. But my favorite all-time song ever, bar none, is God Only Knows by the Beach Boys. So how could I not have it as my favorite record? My other nominees are going to be Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan. Sounds of Silence is the Simon & Garfunkel record I'm going with. And then you've got Revolver by the Beatles is my other one. Pet Sounds is maybe the most covered album of the last 20 years. I mean, it was really well received when it came out, and really over the last 20 years or so, critics have fallen in love with it all over again. I hope, because of sometimes how music journalism trends, that in 20 years they're not like, oh, you know, we may have overrated Pet Sounds. It's not the case. I don't want to describe the sound of it too much, but obviously, like Jason was saying, the creativity in the studio is unparalleled, especially for this time. Harmonies are just on fire. The songs are really lush and sweet. You could probably cut out all the instrument work and just have the vocal tracks on this album, and it would still be really good. Sloop John B is so underrated. There's just so much good stuff. It's so cohesive. It's so unique. It's just this awesome, blissful, just noise for your ears. It's absolutely beautiful. Pet Sounds is my favorite album of 1966.
All right. Well, I don't want to bury the lead, but yeah, Pet Sounds is my number one.
This is the second win and second consecutive year of wins, second nomination overall of the Beach Boys by Joe.
Maybe number one album of all time. That's debatable. I'd like to go through the next 50 years kind of and see, but it's definitely up there. Everything you two said about it, you know, it's the perfect pop album. I hold it slightly higher regard than Revolver, but you know, again, Revolver is probably a top 10 album of all time as well. So I don't think much needs to be said about either of them. The rest of my list was, you know, I'm not a Bob Dylan fan, so I'm the only one without Blonde on Blonde on my list. I went with If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears by the Mamas and the Papas. Their debut, I think, is really good. California Dreaming, solid, harmonies, a different kind of, it's the California sound, but it's not quite in the Beach Boys realm, but it has some really nice harmonies between the male and the female singers, which I like. I have Simon & Garfunkel's Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. It was their first real album that they really got to work on in the studio. And then also I threw the Kinks on there with Face to Face, which is kind of a cool sort of concept-esque album from Ray Davies. And the Boys, so that's it. I mean, Pet Sounds, everybody, this was an easy year, I think. It's going to get a lot harder. I don't know if we'll ever have another year where we all agree on the top choice, so enjoy it, boys.
I was just about to say, let's take a moment and revel in the fact that we've got a Triple Crown winner. I don't think it's going to – maybe the year Cracked Rearview Mirror by Hootie and the Blowfish came out, but I don't think it's going to happen again for the three of us. And glad you brought up the Kinks. Every year that I'm looking at in the mid to late 60s, the Kinks would probably be around the top 10. So the trouble with these lists is there's going to be so many artists that don't get mentioned but are awesome.
For sure. I wanted, before we close out this video, I wanted to pose a question to you guys. Do you think there will ever be a year? And if so, when do you think it will happen that we get 15 different albums?
I'm gonna say 2000. Well, no, me and Joe might kind of share some stuff in the early 2000s because we like a lot of really good female pop singers. Late 90s is my guess. Late 90s is my guess.
I could see it happening as soon as the 70s.
It could be the 70s. I think maybe late 80s. I think our tastes might be pretty divergent by then. I'm not sure. It's going to be weird, but I think it'll happen at some point. But who knows when? It could happen next year. Who knows?
Will we all be friends still after we get to that point and we have a massive disagreement on all 15? It might ruin the friendship. Who knows?
The 80s are going to get pretty messy, I think. It could split us up forever.
Well, no doubt, 1966, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys.
That's right. Well, okay, that closes the book on 1966. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications, and we will be back with 1967 very shortly.